grows your food? Okay, it was who grows your food. I changed it actually to who grows our food because I think we're all in this together, and that's what we're thinking about. So it's not you over there, your food. It's all of us together, and
Right.
for us to consider together who grows our food. To help us understand that, for the second part of the class, we have a guest coming. Will Lembeck is his name, and he's from Migrant Justice, which is an organization based in Vermont that works with dairy farm workers. So I'm going to start with the sort of theoretical background stuff, and then we're going to hear the real story of what it's like to be a migrant farm worker in the bucolic hills of Vermont and northeast United States. So I'm gonna share my screen um, so that you can see the information I want you to see. When I share my screen, I can't see you anymore, and you can't see each other. Um, and so I would like you not to be hesitant about turning on your microphone and shouting out and saying what you think about the information I'm presenting and asking questions, and I'll ask you questions. So please don't be shy uh, within this stilted Zoom format that we're in. Okay. The other thing I will say as I get up my screen to share is that I'm not an expert on this topic. I set out to learn. Mary, who is here in the class, was going to do this class, and she got a new job and couldn't put the time in to get ready. So she sent me her resources, and I learned from her resources. I found some of my own, but uh, a week ago I didn't know a whole lot about this. And it's interesting that we don't know a whole lot about who grows our food, and I think it's something that we need to find out about. But before I start on that, I just want to alert you all, the regulars, that we had to change the date of the next class. It was supposed to be April 27th. The next class in this lecture series, as distinct from the cooking ones, is going to now be on May 4th. So make a note of that. We won't be here on the 27th. The next cooking class, as I think Lee said, is Middle Eastern food, and that is 2 weeks from tonight. But just to remind you, the goals for the class series are set up here, and we're still on the same one as we were last time. Become more aware of how systemic racism impacts the food system of which we are part. So we're still doing that by talking about farm labor. Okay. So when I started thinking about this topic, who grows our food, these are the questions I came up with. Where is it grown? Who owns the farms? Who works on those farms? And what's it like to work on those farms? Um, but although we're talking about the US food system, I immediately had another question, which was, well, how much of our food is imported? So you want to hazard a guess? How much of our food is imported? Just shout out the number you think it is. What percentage?
I think 70, yeah.
70? I heard 70. Any other numbers?
60.
60?
Just shoot.
So more than half people are thinking?
Yeah,
Well, I'll show you. So the good old USDA is good at producing data. So what this chart shows for total consumed food on this top line, and then a whole bunch of other different foods are the percent of food that is imported. So it's much less. Well, it depends on the food actually, but if we just look at the total for the moment, we got years across the top starting in 1990. We don't have the most recent years because it takes a long time to calculate these data. But right now it's about 20. So about 20% of our food is imported, but it's quite variable in terms of when you look at different kinds of food. So some are much less than 20, some are pretty much everything. If you look at tropical products down here, it would make sense that there's not a whole lot of tropical agricultural zones in the United States. Pretty much all of the tropical products are imported. But other things are a little more surprising. So just take a minute to look at these numbers and tell me what you see. And again, I can't see your hands or anything, so you're just going to have to be bold and jump in and tell me what you see.
Fish.
Fish.
I can't get
Well, I'm
over
really
the fact
surprised at the fish. Yeah, fish. What is
fish and
What do you
shellfish,
see there?
going on?
96.2%.
So
But this
virtually
is
all
what
of
their
it's
ocean-
imported.
If
Say
it's in
again?
an ocean, if it's in an ocean, it's imported, I guess.
Well, I think it depends. It's dependent on where the fishing boat is based. And so in back here in 1990, it was a lot imported, but still only 56%. I don't know if you have read about the fishing industry and the sort of slave labor that exists, mostly I think in Asia, on enormous boats that are out there catching a lot of the fish that we eat. You should look it up if you don't know, but I think the fish that we're looking up here, a lot of it is of doubtful provenance in terms of the labor that was used to produce it. So fish is really surprising. We could actually spend the whole class just looking at this chart, but we're not going to do that. So I'm just going to, any other things stick out to you?
Spices.
Spices, mostly imported.
Yeah.
And there's a whole history there of the spice trade.
Oh, yeah.
And how, they were coming a lot from Asia, and how much of trade hundreds of years ago was based on those spices, and how many wars were fought over those spices.
And then what tropical products, things like pineapple and things like that, but we get that from Hawaii.
Right?
The tropical products,
Only so much.
that's a big number, 96.4.
Yep. And that's because there aren't many tropical zones in the United States.
Right.
But look at all fresh vegetables going from 8.6 to 22
Yeah.
in the course of 25 years or so.
Yeah.
So many more vegetables are being imported than used to be.
Wow.
And you see that in the supermarket. Our supermarket, well, we'll come to the consequences. I'm going to move on because of time. This shows this similar sorts of data, but it just shows the fact that that imported foods are becoming a greater and greater part of what we buy, of what we eat. And this shows exactly where they're what the kinds of foods are that are coming in that way.
Amazing.
The other question, of course, is where they come from. And this may be in terms of countries is what you might have predicted. So our neighbors to the north and south are very large contributors, and the European Union also, but then that's a big block, and there are many countries there together. And then this shows what is coming from those places. And just to point out that fish and seafood, who would have known? India and Indonesia. That's the major import. So of the food that comes from those countries, a lot of it is fish and seafood.
Huh.
This is, some of these numbers, percent of the total, come to be pretty small from the US perspective. But what I'd also point out is that for many countries, this would be a large percentage of their export. This would be a large proportion of their economy would be based on exporting food to us. So it's going up now up to about 20% from about probably 10-12% 20 years ago. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing?
Some of it I noticed that there it's per billion. The numbers were per billion. So, if it's value per billion.
Yeah,
per
this is
billion
billions of
dollars.
dollars.
Yeah,
Mhm.
what they make, what they get. So that's we never think of it in those terms, but boy, that's hit you in the face with that. That's dollars per yeah.
It's a lot of money. So
It's
is it a good thing for the producing countries?
Yeah.
Is it a good thing for US agriculture? Is it a good thing for US consumers? Anybody want to suggest anything about this?
Well, it's not a good thing for the planet just because of emissions of transporting it here.
I'm just going to stop share for a minute so we can talk about this. So it's not so there's transportation issues if we're importing food from a long way away. There's a carbon cost to moving that food from point A to point B. Although I was thinking, you have to think also about what the carbon cost of producing that food in the location that it's produced is. If you're trying to run a nice local food operation in New England in the winter and you're heating your greenhouse, then I don't know what the balance is. But anyway, it is something that we need to think about, and that we'll talk about more in the next class when we talk about the environmental costs of our diet.
I would think that in terms of having to grow food that's then going to be transported long distances, that it might affect the nutritional value of it, because obviously it's got to be picked kind of green and it's got to have processes done to it so it doesn't rot before it gets to us. And maybe it's not as nutritionally sound as it might have been if it were locally grown.
Mm-hmm. And certainly taste wise,
Right.
it's one of the problems with moving food from a long distance. So we might question the nutritional content.
Bob just brought a tomato home. There's no such good thing as a good tomato in the winter. I'm like, why'd you buy that? It looks so beautiful.
Right. So I mean,
you have to learn how to eat differently.
Yeah. So we've got very accustomed to eating food of all kinds at all times, because it is a worldwide market now, and so we expect to see a broad range of fruits and vegetables in the places where we buy food. Where when I was a child, we certainly didn't see that. Very few fruits and vegetables available in the winter.
A lot of the food also that's being like grown and transporting it's going to rot, and it's like gonna die, and so it's already like after all of that like carbon cost and cost of money to get it over to America from these distances, and it's already rotten, and a lot of like stores and stuff will throw food away too, and so it's like
And that's another issue we're going to talk about in the next class, because the amount of food waste, 30-40% of the food that's grown is never going to be consumed. But the topic of this week is, we're thinking about workers now. So is this good for workers? Is this good for people growing the food?
So I would say that, if we think about the fact that while a lot of people in this country can't afford to eat well, the cost of food is relatively inexpensive. And that means what are we not paying for somewhere along the line? And a lot of it is the people growing the food in other countries. Sometimes it's as bad as like slave labor. It's really, really oppressive. So we're participating in that by default, whether we know it or not, in terms of the conditions that they're growing much of this in. I've read about cocoa and sugar for some examples that are truly like slave labor. So I think it's a really important factor to consider, and I'm glad we're covering it.
But also in the
Essentially,
United States.
what has happened in many of these countries is that there has been a transition from farmers growing food that they're going to eat themselves and they're going to support their family and has got a local purpose, to farmers that are producing cash crops that are going to be sold on the world market, and they're going to receive money, and then they're going to use that money to buy food. Now, whether that's beneficial to you as a farmer depends on how much money you get for the food that you've grown. Uh,
Yeah.
The way that these things work, though, usually is that the farmer in the global south does not have the power to set the price. So the price is being set by the purchaser, and very often it does not work out as advantageous for the local farmer, because the money that they're getting from their labor from growing the cash crops is not sufficient to meet their own needs. So although we're, what we're really, when I set out for this class, I think we're talking about US workforce. I think it's really important to recognize that this is a worldwide system now, and that there are interests of working people in all over the world that have to be taken into account. So when you're buying your food from abroad, you have even less knowledge of the working conditions under which that food was grown than in this country. Any other things to add before we move on to this country?
I also think the longer the supply chains are, the more vulnerable they are to disruption, as we saw with COVID. And even things like there was a delay in, I think, shipping containers or something like that. And, if you were going to ship food on those shipping containers, then that will end up affecting your food supply also, even though there's no issue with the growing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, you also don't have a lot of control over pesticide usage in other countries. So whatever they're using to grow their crops, you're at the mercy of buying.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I was talking to a friend of mine about this. You can buy organically grown food, or food labeled as organically grown, from all over the world now. And what system is in place to monitor that? Well, you could ask the same question in this country, actually. Well, you should ask the same question in this country, but the question can be even more. There is the resource in this country to monitor organic growing practices, probably not in many parts of the world.
Yeah.
The other thing that somebody mentioned that I think it was Grace is that let's just come back to the PowerPoint here, is that we do have a cheap food system in this country. That we pay less as a percentage of our income for food than most places in the world, maybe than all places in the world, and so there is this big pressure to get food here as cheaply as possible, and to have it for you to buy as cheaply as possible. But back to this country, and it all starts with slavery, and we have to remember that. It's really important that the slave trade was instituted to bring labor in for agricultural purposes. We sort of have this idea of these frontier farmers, and there were frontier farmers, and they were mom and pop or whatever, growing food for themselves, but there are also these large plantations where one family was never going to be able to do this, and so you needed cheap labor. Started out maybe with indentured servants, but that was limited. Indigenous Americans were not interested and could not be compelled easily to work on these farms, and so slavery was instituted, and people were brought across from Africa for U.S. agricultural, U.S. and Caribbean, South American agricultural needs. And it's sort of the difference between a cash crop for profit versus subsistence farming. So it also relates back to the beginnings of agriculture when we were talking about that and the fact that it created wealth. These are people trying to create wealth. The slave owners are trying to create wealth with their plantations. But whether you're on a plantation or whether you're a frontier farmer, both required the theft of land, and that it's important to recognize that. So that's a long time ago, but that was the beginning of the agricultural system in the United States, and even after the Civil War and the outlawing of slavery, there were still substitutes put in its place, particularly in the South, that allowed the exploitation of African American labor. So there's a sharecropping system whereby people are sort of indentured into working in agricultural production under conditions they don't control. And they're indebted to the landowners, the person that owns the land, and not being able to make much of a living. And then, of course, prison labor, where African Americans would be arrested under very flimsy charges and then used on work gangs on plantations.
And it's a couple of things that are interesting about that is that the freedom of enslaved people said that there could not be forced labor provided for free unless it was somebody who was convicted of a felony and imprisoned. So they created a whole system to imprison people so they could get free labor that way. Yeah. The other is that freed slaves were going to get the 40 acres and a mule as kind of reparations until Lincoln was killed and Johnson took over and gave that to white people, but not Black people. So they ended up with nothing to start with. And they ended up being on sharecrop type situations because they didn't have anything to start with.
Yes, good.
It's fundamental roots of, not passing on, not accumulating wealth or passing it on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, one thing that even when I was young, fairly young, but also maybe through parts of my teen years, I remember workers out in the farms who were from the prison, and also prisoners were used not only to work on farms, but also used to work on the roads.
Yeah.
And repair roads.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in what little town known as Hazardville. Hazardville became what is joined with others little towns, and it became Enfield.
So this is Connecticut we're talking about.
We're talking Connecticut.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of farms.
Yeah.
There were a lot of farms there. Between some were crops, but there was a lot of tobacco. They were crops, so there were tobacco farms.
Yeah.
That was big business in the area.
Yes, tobacco farms, right?
Yeah.
So we moved on from that form of slavery, and I don't know if you're all familiar with the Bracero program.
No.
But essentially, throughout the 20th century, I mean, this is an interesting timeline if we just follow through here. Our neighbor to the south, Mexico, there was the Mexican Revolution in the early part of the century, and so things are kind of roiled up down there, and a lot of unrest, people needing work. The First World War, the men are sent off to Europe. There's a shortage of labor on farms in the United States. And so we imported workers from Mexico in the first version of the program. The war ended, the Depression came, a lot of people out of work. Mexican Americans now required to leave because we don't need them anymore. The Second World War begins. The men go off to Europe again. Mexico joins the war. we interned Japanese Americans,
Oh, yeah.
and so they are no longer available as part of the farm labor. And so we formally instituted the Bracero program, which gave US work permits to millions of Mexicans to come in under regulated conditions temporarily to work on specific farms. And that program lasted for 20 years. And has been, I mean, I don't know many details of that program, but I'm just going to show you a picture which sort of gives you a flavor, and be prepared, it's not a nice picture. So this is the immigration line down in Texas. And what you're seeing here are workers coming in from Mexico, and they're being sprayed with DDT.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And so this is how these people were being treated.
I have a question. What is DDT? That's what you said?
What is DDT? I don't remember what the chemical name is, but it's a pesticide that was outlawed for use. It's the book that Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring about.
Yeah.
No, it's the pesticide. It's a toxic it's toxic to most forms of life, I think. Which is why it was used. It was used as a pesticide, and then it was found to have all sorts of other negative consequences, leading to Silent Spring. And it's amazing to think that it was being used directly on humans.
Oh, yeah.
And in fact, the administrator of the Bracero program later described it as legalized slavery.
Oh, yeah.
So
They didn't earn much, that's for sure.
they didn't earn much. They had, and they didn't even earn as much as they were supposed to earn. So you know, we've got modern equivalents of that now, but that also abuse workers. And a characteristic of them is that these programs are absolutely ripe for abuse.
Yeah.
Okay, so overall, though, if you look between 1950 and 2000, the number of farm workers, these are people working on family farms and they're hired farm workers, has been going down. So it's about threefold decrease in the last 50 years of the last century. So what do you think explains this?
Mechanization?
That's my guess. We note that, so it's going down. If you look at this looks at the size of farms. So longer time scale here, 1850 to 2020. First 85 years or so, we see an increase in land going into farming, going into agriculture, which then peaks, and an increase in the number of farms. So we had about 7 million farms in 1935. And then in the next 30, 40 years, the number of farms really dropped as the size of farms increased. Land in farms, once it reached that peak, maybe went down a little bit, but not very much. So I think this must be big farms, mechanization, reduced need for labor.
And less farms, right? Everything's owned by a few
Right.
companies.
Right. Well, yes. So there are fewer farms. So the number of farms is now about 2 million, was 7 million. So a lot of them have been bought out and in large units.
I think there have also been the development of some GMOs specifically to work with mechanized harvesting. So all really straight and even so that you can take it with the machine.
Yes. So and you don't need anybody to weed. So if you the GMO plants are paired with pesticides, herbicides that can be used and sprayed, and so you know, hand weeding or whatever you're going to use for weed doesn't need to be done in those sorts of farms. This we looked at last time, when we were looking more directly at race, and this is ownership. So pointing out that whites own 98% of U.S. agricultural land, privately owned U.S. agricultural land. So, and whether you look at value or acres, this is the ownership, not the labor force, but the ownership is a white enterprise. And there are some Latinos, some African Americans, but in general, it's a white enterprise in terms of ownership. I found this an interesting piece of data. So 2 million farms total. They're divided here into size. So gross cash farm income, less than 350,000, and so on. So 3 small, mid-size, large. And the darker orange here is the share of farms. So most farms are still small because it doesn't take very many big farms to cover a large area. So although most farms, 90% of them, are earning less than $350,000 of income a year, those few big ones are actually producing 46% of the food. And I was talking to Phoebe about this last night, and there's some interesting questions that arise from this. First of all, what sort of food? What is this production? So this is just relating farm income with volume of production. So what is being produced here? And then the second thing is, this is not looking at the inputs at all. It's just looking at the size of the farm. So just because there's a lot of farms here producing not as much food and a few farms here producing a lot of food doesn't necessarily mean that these farms are working more efficiently. Because what we want is another bar here looking at the inputs to this farming. How much energy is being used by these farms? How much water is being used by these farms? How efficient are these farms at transforming this input and turning it into food? And I think that's an interesting question, and we will that'll be another thing that we want to come back to next time.
It also doesn't address the quality of the food.
Nothing about the quality.
Nothing.
Yes.
Even though we already know some of it, but yeah.
Yes.
But also, if they're producing large amounts of a single crop, and if much of those crops are things like corn to make corn syrup, which directly leads to obesity. So we're doing this good. And soybeans is the other one, right? Trans fat. So, and feeding livestock, which has a lot to do with climate problems.
Right.
So, yeah.
So you're thinking the same way as I was, Grace. So what is being produced here? And when this is looking at U.S. cash crop receipts in billions of dollars. So this is a measure of how much of these particular crops are being produced. And the first thing I noticed when I looked at this wheel was, well, I don't eat much of this. So I don't often eat soybeans, occasionally tofu, but not very often. I'm not a big tofu eater. The corn being grown here is not sweet corn. This is field corn. And so I'm not eating that. I certainly don't eat cotton, and I eat some of these. But a lot of this, as Grace pointed out, is not being grown for human consumption, but rather as part of a larger system. These are being grown for animal production. And so, sorry?
And maybe ethanol too.
and maybe ethanol, or many different things. But anyway, the efficiency of those large farms, I think, is based on a very simplistic idea about, we grow corn and soybeans for a reason. It's because they're very efficient at taking sunlight and turning them into macronutrients and turning them into something that is useful for something. Not not very nutritive, just really producing energy.
But therefore, it's the animal feed. But I mentioned earlier, but it's long shelf life products that people do
Yes.
eat, but they make people sick. So
Yes.
it's cheap to produce, cheap to buy, and not nutritive, but obesogenic.
Right. So it's part of that same food system. It's part of that same cheap food system. So these are used to make. We don't eat them directly, but the number of products that come out of corn that are used in processed foods is truly enormous.
And
And so-
soybeans,
and-
soy lecithin is in a lot of things.
But also the soy oil is used to make trans fat, which is really it's hydrogenated fat, which is extremely bad for the heart and cardiovascular system. And it's put into baked products, etc. And it's fried. used for frying.
And I'm allergic to corn and soybeans.
Wow.
Well, that's half of the U.S. crop productions off your menu. God, terrible. I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on because there's some other data I just want to show you before Will joins us. I just put this in because I wondered how much of that food that we were just looking at was actually going to be exported. Turns out that overall about the same amount is exported as is imported. It sort of balances out, interesting enough. So for some crops it's much higher. So we don't make too many clothes in this country anymore. So 75% of the cotton grown in this country goes abroad to be made into clothing. So it varies, but overall, these are the high exports, but about 20% of the food that we grow is then exported to other countries. Okay, so let's look at the people who are growing, who are doing the work on this farm. These data come from, it says down here, the National Agricultural Workers Survey. It's a Department of Labor survey, and the people writing about these surveys say that this is maybe one of the more reliable forms of data about this topic, because what we're now entering the world of what they call here as unauthorized or undocumented people who are working in this country but do not have legal permission to do so. So what we're looking at here between 91 and 2016 is the percentage of crop farm workers. So these are crop farm workers, not people working in animal production. And they're hired crop farm workers, so they're not people working on a family farm, as part of the family. But there's a number of fascinating things about this that I didn't know before I found this. So maybe before I put this up, I might have asked you, what percentage of US crop farm workers, of hired crop farm workers, were born abroad? And the answer is now, you can see, it's about 3/4, because these are foreign-born unauthorized, i.e. undocumented, foreign-born authorized, foreign-born who are now US citizens, and then the blue part at the top is US-born. So the US agricultural system is entirely dependent on people born outside the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Is that surprising to you, or is this something you already knew?
It's larger than I thought.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
it's a stereotype that I was hoping wasn't true.
Uh-huh.
Wow.
I think the number I remember is that 69% of the U.S. workforce was born, agricultural workforce was born in Mexico.
Mm.
Mexico is a big country,
Mm.
and so there are a lot of people there. So a lot of people who could come here.
What do you think was going on in 2001, 2000, where, I mean, the numbers aren't much higher, but that there was more unauthorized?
NAFTA was the North American Free Trade Agreement, happened under Clinton.
Yep.
And it led to a lot of Mexicans leaving because they were kind of desperate. And, maybe they would be desperate here, but less so.
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of Mexicans left because of that.
And so,
And that would be Clinton came in 92 and left in
right.
2000. So
this increase could be connected to the fact that cheap U.S. corn that we saw a couple of slides ago was being sent to Mexico, displacing Mexican farmers or making it impossible for Mexican farmers to make a living and leading them to come to this country.
Thank you for pointing that out. Yes. Forced labor.
Yeah.
Yeah. Boy.
So many workers, most workers are born abroad. Here's another one that sort of interests me as well, because we have this picture, stereotypic picture, where we get of migrant farm workers sort of moving around, following the crop. But, in fact, most of them, they did migrate, but I don't know if you can call them migrants. We're going to hear from Will soon, but and I think the people that work in the farms in Vermont have been there a long time and are staying. So the larger proportion of these crop farm workers are not really migrants. They're actually settled. They're living somewhere and they're participating in the workforce as agricultural laborers. There are some still, that's the yellow bar, that move around from place to place to follow the crop and to pick the fruit when it's ripe, etc., etc. And there are some that in this terminology are called shuttlers, that actually live somewhere and then move temporarily to another place to work in agriculture and then return home. And then there's this group here that are relatively new to agriculture, and so they've been working in agriculture for a shorter length of time. We don't know which pattern they're going to follow, but it's not. This is a stable workforce. It's not a transient kind of thing. The U.S. agriculture is absolutely dependent on these foreign-born workers.
But in New England, there's no crop in the winter.
In New England, there's what?
No crop.
What
do they?
Right. Well,
no
I
work.
think. Well, let me just show. This is a little bit different. This is H2A. This is the H2A. This is the modern day Bracero program, where you can make farm workers are hired in Mexico, often by contractors, brought to the United States to work at a specific farm and under agreed upon working conditions that may or may not be met. But this is showing, I'm just putting this to show where they are working. This is a small proportion. There's about 250 million people in this program at the moment. No, 250,000, I'm sorry. 250,000 people in this program at the moment. This is showing where they're working. So New York has some, but this is not this part of the country. It's a different kind of agriculture here.
And is this only crop, or is this also?
No, this is the visa. So I think this would
Yeah.
this is H2A visa holders.
Yeah, so it's not distinguishing the type of agriculture, because like around here, there are egg farms that migrants work
Yes.
in.
Yeah.
Tobacco still exists around Connecticut. So there
Dairy.
are crops that, or to farming that they do work in.
Dairy is one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I'm just going to show one more slide, and then I'm going to introduce Will. And just to point out that there's a whole set of laws that govern the rights of workers in this country. And very often exceptions are made, and not in a good way, for agricultural workers. So the Fair Labor Standards Act came in the 30s, and the deal made in Congress at the time was that farm workers would be excluded, and I think domestic workers were also excluded, because that was the only way it was going to get through Congress. In particular, senators and representatives from the South were not prepared to give up the oppressive conditions that governed the employment of largely at that time African Americans in the South. And so they were excluded for all farm workers at that time. Some improvements been made since, but in general, whichever law you look at, there are exclusions. They don't cover farm workers, in particular minimum wage and overtime. The National Labor Relations Act exempts agricultural workers, making it much harder for them to organize. So I'm going to stop this piece there. There's this nice screen down here that says migrant justice. And so that is Will. Are you here, Will? Are you ready to join us? As we wait for him, any last comments on what you've learned so far? Things to add? Okay, so last summer, CLIC hosted an event. A message went out to different organizations in New England asking if we were interested in participating in the Milk with Dignity tour. And I think most of us had never heard of the Milk with Dignity tour, but Milk with Dignity sounds pretty good. And so who wouldn't want to participate in the Milk with Dignity tour? And and Will came, Abel came, there was another person came and gave a presentation at CLIC, and we learned an enormous amount. And what I've given you so far is some statistics and numbers that sort of indicate potential for abuse in this system and exploitation of people. Will is going to tell us a little more, and he's going to tell us in depth about the work of migrant justice, and in particular their Milk with Dignity campaign. So welcome, Will, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Good to see you, Headley. Good evening, everybody. My name is Will Lambeck, and I am a staff member with the organization Migrant Justice. And just before I begin, we're going till 8, is that right?
Yeah.
All right, fantastic. And would you mind, Headley, signing me as a co-host so I could share my screen? Oh, looks like you did it.
I signed you, I gave you permission to share screen, yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so I am going to be giving a short presentation, and just a show of hands. Well, I don't know if I'll be able to see all your hands now, but I know at least one or two of you were at the Dignity Tour presentation last year. But was anybody else there? Or you can put it in the chat if your video's off.
It's just is Lee,
Okay.
Lee, myself, and Chelsea. Maybe
Okay, cool. Well, so for the three of you, this will be somewhat of a review. Some of these slides will look familiar, but for the rest of you, this will be new. So I'm going to share my screen now. All right, hopefully folks can see it. Cool. So I am from the organization Migrant Justice, and I'm here to talk with you, as Hedley said, about the Milk with Dignity program. And if it sounds like a nice thing, but you don't know what it is, hopefully by the end of this class, you're all going to be experts on it. But first, Migrant Justice is a grassroots organization founded and led by immigrant dairy workers in the state of Vermont. For the past dozen years or so, it's been organizing within the dairy farm working community for human rights and economic justice, doing grassroots base building, going meeting with workers on farms, inviting them to community assemblies in different regions around the area, and then from those assemblies, talking about what common problems workers are facing, having workers envision collective solutions, and from that, developing campaigns that seek to get to the root causes of those problems. And so some of our work focuses on more law and policy on the immigrant rights side of things, but a big focus of the work is on labor and housing conditions in agriculture, and particularly in the dairy industry. So we're based in Vermont, which in New England accounts for about 2/3 to 3/4 of dairy production in the region. It's the dairy epicenter of the Northeast, although not nationally. And just like in those stats that you are seeing for nationwide agricultural workforces, the dairy industry in the Northeast, and in particular in Vermont, is overwhelmingly reliant on immigrant workers. And a little bit different from the stats that you saw, it's almost 100% undocumented workers. Very few workers have been able to normalize their status. And you were hearing about H-2A visas. Those are restricted to seasonal agricultural employment. So things like dairy and probably the egg farm as well that I heard somebody mention would be excluded from H-2A visas. So dairy workers fall into that category that Hedley mentioned of people who are immigrants in this country, but not really fitting the archetype of what one might think of as a migrant worker. People aren't transitory. They're working oftentimes at the same farm for years on end, sometimes decades at a time. They're folks who are setting down roots in their communities, having families, and becoming a part of the community. And the industry itself is characterized by poverty wages. By our studies, about half of dairy workers are making below state minimum wage. Long hours. The average work week is 60 to 80 hours. Oftentimes workers are doing 12-hour shifts without breaks. About half of workers are working 7 days a week without a day off. Bad housing. Nearly all dairy workers, immigrant dairy workers that is, are living in employer-provided housing. And that is part of the labor market. The understanding is that workers are basically on call 24/7, oftentimes working around the clock, and so farmers want them on the farm property, being able to work those hours. And the housing is oftentimes overcrowded. 2 or 3 workers in a room, sometimes workers sharing a bed, as one worker works their 12-hour shift in the day while the other sleeps, and then they switch and one sleeps while the other works. Injury and work-related illness rates are astronomical. 80 to 90% of workers have been injured by animals, by chemical, by heavy machinery, by environmental and biological hazards, and a total lack of workplace protections, both health and safety protections, and then protections against things like sexual harassment, gender discrimination, racial and national origin discrimination, or protections against unjust firings. And this is just a couple examples of farm worker housing to give you a sense of where folks are being forced to live. One farm worker put it this way, that the housing isn't fit for human habitation. It's not even suitable for the animals on the farm. And in fact, workers are oftentimes living right with the animals in what are euphemistically termed barn apartments that are built right into the barn. So sometimes sleeping literally right on top of the cows. So these are the underlying conditions in the dairy industry. And our data and knowledge particularly comes from Vermont. But we would wager that conditions on dairy farms that employ immigrant workers in Connecticut would not be substantially different. And so after a couple years of organizing farm by farm, trying to reform conditions, improve pay, improve housing, get a day off, and having some successes, but finding those successes to be limited as well, farm workers really started a deep study to think about why are conditions this way, and why are the human rights abuses that we're facing on farms so systemic and so endemic throughout the industry, and came to understand the structure of the dairy industry within this concept of corporate supply chains. And corporate supply chains is a way that a lot of the contemporary economy is constructed. Where there are a few corporations at the top that hold an immense amount of power. And then, I just got a note. Are folks able to see these slides?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. So there are a few corporations at the top that have an immense amount of power. And then those corporations are able to drive down prices, which creates a downward pressure on worker wages and working and housing conditions. And so even if there are farmers out there who want to be model employers, who want to be providing living wage and dignified working and housing conditions, their hands are largely tied by the structure of the industry that perpetuates low milk prices, volatility that makes it difficult for farmers to plan, and in general puts farm owners and farm workers really in the same position near the bottom of the supply chain. So workers came to understand this, that hey, we're both getting screwed over, and if we want to create real systemic change in the dairy industry, we need to create a solution that puts the responsibility for reform at the top of the supply chain where it belongs. And dairy workers weren't the only ones to be coming to this conclusion. Migrant Justice in 2014 traveled down to Florida to meet with a group of tomato pickers who had organized through a group called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. And the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, or CIW, had pioneered this new model of social change called worker-driven social responsibility, or WSR. And it was based on this analysis of workers organizing within corporate supply chains to create binding agreements that set dignified labor conditions throughout a supply chain. So the CIW had created this program called the Fair Food Program, and they had been organizing since the 90s to bring large companies that buy tomatoes and other produce into the Fair Food Program. And they've had tremendous success winning campaigns against Walmart, Taco Bell, Burger King, Sodexo, Aramark, and many others. And they have 14 agreements with some of the largest companies in the world that commit them to sourcing tomatoes and other produce now as well from farms that comply with workers' human rights. And this model has spread to other sectors outside of agriculture and other countries. Bangladeshi garment workers have created the Bangladesh Fire Safety Accords, which works in a similar function, holding large clothing and apparel brands responsible to ensure that workers in Bangladesh aren't being killed in the horrific industrial accidents like the Rana Plaza fire and the Tazreen fire and the Rana Plaza collapse that have killed hundreds and thousands of garment workers. Construction workers in Minnesota have now adapted this model into the construction industry and are targeting real estate developers to hold them responsible for working conditions on construction sites on their projects. And then Migrant Justice adapted this model to the dairy industry in the Northeast to create the Milk with Dignity program. So the Milk with Dignity program, how it works is that Migrant Justice, as a workers' organization, signs legally binding agreements with companies that purchase dairy, with dairy buying corporations. And those corporations commit to requiring their farm suppliers to enroll in the Milk with Dignity program. And they also commit to paying those suppliers a premium or a higher price for their milk as an incentive to do so and to cover the costs of farms' compliance. When farms come into the program, they receive that premium and they have to improve their conditions to comply with a worker-authored code of conduct that covers wages, health and safety policies, hours and rest, housing, and creates protections against sexual harassment, discrimination, and unjust firings. To make sure that that code of conduct doesn't just exist on paper, farms must allow Migrant Justice to come onto the farm to conduct regular education sessions. And that's what you see in this photo here, where farmers are informed about their rights under the program. And then a third-party monitoring organization, the Milk with Dignity Standards Council, regularly audits farms to ensure that they're complying. Excuse me, and staffs a 24-hour complaint line so that workers at any point in time can call the Standards Council to report an abuse or a condition that doesn't comply with the code of conduct. And then the Standards Council can investigate to determine what's going on. And if a farm repeatedly refuses to comply with the code of conduct, or if they're unwilling or unable to improve conditions, they can be suspended from the program, which means that they lose their premium and they lose their ability to sell to any company that signed a Milk with Dignity agreement. That's what we call the binding enforcement mechanism, or the teeth of the program, to make sure that these rights become a reality. So now we have created this program and we have to put it into practice. And the first company that farm workers approached was Ben & Jerry's. Starting in 2015, farm workers approached Ben & Jerry's to ask them to join in. Ben & Jerry's, of course, is a global brand based in Vermont. They've made a name for themselves as a company that takes on social causes and progressive stances, and should have been a no-brainer, right? Unfortunately, it came.
Oh, we lost him.
Yeah, we lost him.
Finally did. Since
Will, we just lost your sound for
no.
a few seconds. So could you just start with the Ben & Jerry's story? Ben & Jerry's was a no-brainer. That was the last thing we had.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Headley. But unfortunately, they did not jump on the opportunity. It took 3 years of public campaigning and consistent pressure and negotiation before they finally signed the Milk with Dignity agreement, which they did, as you can see in this photo. And this was a really historic moment. I mean, this was the first time in history that a dairy company had sat across the table from farm workers in their supply chain and signed a business agreement to take into account working conditions in their supply chain. And since they joined, 100% of Ben and Jerry's Northeast dairy supply chain has come in, which accounts for most of their global dairy production. That means that for hundreds of workers in Vermont and New York State, they are benefiting from the protections of the Code of Conduct. They're receiving regular education sessions. The Milk with Dignity Standards Council is responding to complaints and auditing their farms. And the program has been a tremendous success. So I'm going to play a video now for y'all to be able to hear from some farm workers in the Milk with Dignity program about how it's transforming conditions and what it's meant for them. This video is 6 minutes.
Mi trabajo empezando pues nos levantamos en la mañana, llegamos, prendemos las máquinas, arreglamos todo, sacamos las vacas del corral, las metemos para ordeñar. O sea, es todo lo que se hace en un día normal, pero que hay ranchos que trabajan de 12 horas corridas, le dan media hora de comida de las 12 horas, eso está más pesado.
¿Por qué es necesario? Porque es importante para nosotros como trabajadores que salimos de nuestra casa para mejorar nuestras vidas, no para estar viviendo como te dijera, en condiciones que meramente ya no son humanas.
Pero sin el programa nosotros pues no nos aumentaban el sueldo y pues del día de descanso ni se hablara. No sabíamos qué derechos o qué podemos exigir nosotros como trabajadores.
Pues antes aquí no nos tomaban en cuenta como cuando nos enfermábamos. Ni nos llevaban al doctor y pues ese día lo teníamos que trabajar. Y si no lo trabajábamos, pues ese día pues era descontado prácticamente. Y pues ahora bajo el programa de Leche con Dignidad, no lo trabajamos y pues aparte no nos pagan y pues ya los patrones no nos llevan al doctor y pues eso es muy importante para mí, para nosotros.
Bueno, se siente uno más protegido porque ya sabe uno puede, o sea, ellos te orientan a lo que puede pasar, tus derechos que tú tienes como trabajador. El derecho que tienes, el respeto tanto de tu patrón, se siente uno más feliz, más protegido.
Si un día yo, por ejemplo, cuando voy a tirar cal en los grupos o hacer el agua de las patas, no tengo las mascarillas, los guantes, todo lo que necesito para que no me dañe mi salud, entonces ya el patrón tiene que acceder a comprar las cosas.
Ahora ya tenemos un día completo, que antes no se tenía. Bueno, ahora que tengo mi bebé, pues ya pasamos más tiempo con ella. Ya tenemos por lo menos un día para estar con ella todo el día. Se siente uno más seguro por todos los beneficios, pues, y saber todos nuestros derechos.
Mediante el programa se ha hecho posible tener una casa nueva, porque antes estábamos en una traila que estábamos más amontonados, 2 personas en un cuarto, poco espacio. Entonces aquí la nueva vivienda pues ha cambiado demasiado porque todo es nuevo.
Hay algunas personas que le dan miedo para hablar con los dueños o exigirle algo que ocupan o cualquier cosa, ya sea porque pues tienen miedo porque los corran o algo así, los despidan del trabajo. Con el programa nos hace trabajar mejor, más a gusto, más en confianza con los dueños, sabiendo cuáles son nuestros derechos, o sea, de no ser humillado o decir o que te digan cosas que te ofendan. O sea, hay muchos ranchos que pasa eso y por el programa ya no puede pasar eso. Como los del rancheros también se benefician mucho por el programa. Así yo creo que ambos tienen un gran beneficio, como nosotros, un gran beneficio entre ambos.
Y para mí es muy importante que expanda el programa porque por eso el patrón le apoyan a él, pero también como nosotros como trabajadores tenemos esa voz de ya decir, sabes, quiero un día de descanso, quiero que hagas esto, y eso es algo necesario para cada trabajador, para que nosotros nos sintamos seguros en decir algo, no nos sintamos con miedo, sintamos la seguridad de decirle al patrón, sabes qué, quiero esto, y ya no tengamos tanto miedo a ellos.
All right. So, folks, there heard from workers in the Milk with Dignity program talking about the before and after, and we use this phrase a lot about Milk with Dignity creating a new day for human rights in dairy. And every time I see that video, that concept of a new day for me becomes very clear. But while it's having tremendous success for the several hundred workers who are included in the program currently, there are still, of course, many farms and farm workers that are outside the program. And that's why after implementing Milk with Dignity in Ben & Jerry's dairy supply chain, farm workers began to look outward and think where to go to expand the program next. And after some careful consideration, decided to make the next invitation to Hannaford Supermarket, a chain of grocery stores in the Northeast. And they don't have one in Connecticut, but they have about 200 stores in the rest of New England and in New York State, and they're headquartered in Maine. Hannaford is part of a multinational company called Ahold Delhaize, which owns a number of US supermarket brands. Ahold brings in about $100 billion a year in sales. Hannaford is one of the largest buyers of dairy in the Northeast. So when they join the program and follow in Ben & Jerry's footsteps, they'll be able to have a huge impact in expanding the program. But just like Ben & Jerry's before them, Hannaford did not initially jump at this opportunity. And to date, they have yet to sign a Milk with Dignity agreement. So just like with Ben & Jerry's before them, workers have launched a public campaign to call on Hannaford to take responsibility for conditions in their dairy supply chain and take action to join the Milk with Dignity program and ensure that farm workers behind Hannaford brand milk have their rights and dignity respected. So workers have engaged in actions outside stores, in letter writing campaigns, We've gotten Hannaford customers to sign thousands of postcards, make hundreds of calls, send thousands of emails. We have engaged with investors in Hannaford's parent company and have had them put pressure on Ahold, calling on them to urge Hannaford to join the program. Workers have done a number of things. Many food and agriculture, faith-based organizations, labor organizations have endorsed the campaign and called on Hannaford to join. But so far, Hannaford has proven resistant and have yet to join the program. And so that's where you all come in. We are encouraging folks to take action in solidarity with farm workers by calling on Hannaford to join the Milk with Dignity program. And so you can go to our website and learn a lot more about Milk with Dignity and learn about how to take action in solidarity with farm workers' fight for human rights. And then I'll give folks just a second. I see some people are writing that down. And then one thing that folks can do from their homes right now, and I encourage you to do it, is to go to Hannaford's Facebook page and to leave a comment under a recent post from the company. So for anybody who has Facebook, you can take out your phone or log onto your computer and just search Hannaford Supermarkets and find a recent post. And then you'll see under that post, most likely, a bunch of comments from farm workers and from allies, leaving notes like the ones you see on your screen right now, encouraging Hannaford to join the Milk with Dignity program. And we'd ask you to do the same. It doesn't have to be detailed. It could just be join Milk with Dignity. It could be support farm workers, whatever you'd like. But I'll give folks a second to pull up their Facebook and to leave a comment under Hannaford Supermarket. Oh yeah, Leah Hand.
No, I raised that a long time ago as a answer to something. I don't remember what it was now.
Oh, right.
Let me take it off.
As people are doing that, do people have questions for Will? Mike, you have a question?
Yeah, Will, first, thanks. It was very informative and quite moving, frankly. So one of the things that came to my mind during your presentation is it's kind of a question, maybe certainly for myself, but maybe for all of us. And I'll ask the question after I make a statement. So my statement is, I think as a consumer, I'll put myself in this category. I know one of the things I struggle with in our transactional economy is that I rely on, and there's the implication of trust, I rely on the supplier or the supplier's representation with my purchases. And for me, my responsibility, which I'm going to admit I'm not very responsible about, is asking questions that I believe you're trying to make us aware of. And that is, what's the backstory? What's going on behind that Hannaford sign in that, grocery store? And I know I visit Vermont occasionally, and I have this view that all the farmers there are wonderful people, and I don't really ever think about the working conditions. So the question I have for you is, as consumers, how, and this is more a hypothetical question. I'm not expecting an answer, really, unless others want to comment on it. How do we drop our focus on price and start to look at other factors in our daily transactions? And I know the U.S. economy has been great in just driving us toward price is the only factor, but how do we ensure that when we're interacting in the economic system, we really are looking at those other factors? What are the working conditions of the folks providing these services and products for us? And for me, that seems to be a key factor here, is that in the US in particular, and I think it's based on any market-driven economy, is price seems to be the only factor that we consider. And I think that's a root cause of what's going on. And for me, I'm always struggling with this question. How do we look at other things? Hedley, you talked about efficiency of the agricultural system. Well, they're super efficient at generating profits, but they're not super efficient at energy or improving working conditions. So I think somehow the conversation we need to have with ourselves personally and then amongst ourselves is, how do we bring these other factors to the forefront? And I know, Will, that's probably your life's endeavor. But as consumers, how do we bring that to the table every day with those simple decisions or many decisions we make about interacting with other people?
Can I respond? It's Lee. I was just going to say that, to your point, John, it comes with bringing this issue up even beyond the food system. Like, when your town wants to have $5 stores in your town, why is that? That's, that has some of the same components of this whole conversation in it. Most people I hear say, that's great, everything there's really cheap, because of what you just identified as everybody's fixation on price. But you also have to look at the community and who's buying there.
Right.
But I think it's such a big conversation, and the issues you describe have to be brought up in many different areas of conversation.
Yeah, I would agree with both what you said, John, and the premise of your question, as well as your response, Lee. And yeah, I mean, I think, well, yeah, on a number of levels. Oftentimes we'll start presentations. When farm workers giving presentations, they'll ask the crowd, does anybody know where milk comes from? Cows. And the response is yes, but the cows don't milk themselves, and that sort of provides the framework for the ensuing discussion. And so, and the first step is really just pulling back that curtain to get folks to consider this concept of supply chains and the workers who are producing the products to get them onto the shelves for our convenience, right? And then where I would sort of I think an intervention that Migrant Justice oftentimes brings into these conversations is that lots of times folks will just ask us sort of like, okay, just tell me what to buy. Just to tell me what product should I buy? What product should I avoid? And we would say, and I think sort of similar to what you just said, Lee, is that it goes much beyond individual choice and just consumer preference. And that's why we're so focused on mobilizing consumers collectively, getting folks to take action as a group to put pressure on companies in order to make these sorts of systemic reforms, like joining Milk with Dignity and other worker-driven social responsibility programs. Because unfortunately, companies are intelligent, and they have gotten ahead of this idea of conscious consumerism, and they market to it. And unfortunately, there's a lot of false solutions out there. And just to give one example that's in the dairy industry now, soon after the success of Milk with Dignity in Ben and Jerry's supply chain, the company Chobani, a yogurt company, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, last year announced the launch of Fair Trade Dairy. And now some of their yogurts come with this Fair Trade label, which didn't exist previously. And unlike Milk with Dignity, which is based on worker-defined standards and binding enforcement mechanisms, and as you can hear from workers, is really creating a verifiable and documented change in the treatment of workers and their labor and housing conditions. Fair Trade Dairy is completely fictitious. It's a label without meaning. And we've talked to workers on these farms, and some of them have no idea that their farm is in Fair Trade Dairy. Some of them said, "Oh yeah, I think they put a suggestion box, and they come once a month to check it out." That's what this label means. And so we would sort of caution folks to avoid the individual type response of just finding the best looking claim on a label, and focus on what we can do collectively in order to change systems. Yeah, fantastic question. Other folks?
Well, I'm going to just point out, so, I'm just saying, shop at the food co-op. They have meat that they check on the background. And I remember, wasn't that long ago, we're owner members. The people bringing the eggs, they were saying it very publicly, we cannot live on what you're paying us for the eggs. We need a raise, or you're not going to get any eggs anymore. And the co-op had to raise the prices. And now people go, well, it's so expensive to shop at the co-op, but there's a reason it's so expensive. And it's because you're supporting small local farmers who are hoping to make enough money to live off of their own farm. It's not only just migrant workers, it's your local, just people, family-owned farms trying to buck this system. And they need our support. Farmers markets. Another great way to support by paying a little more, showing that's what you want, is the right kind of conditions.
Yeah, and I would agree with that for sure, with a note of caution that that small scale doesn't always translate into fair conditions, and many of the farm workers that we're talking about are on farms with one or two workers, and it's not mega CAFO dairies. It can be farms with 100 or 150 head, and including organic farms. Some of the worst working conditions that I've seen are on organic farms, unfortunately. So wholeheartedly agree with you, but I think with a note of caution there as well.
I mean, the value to what you're suggesting, Jean, is that we ourselves can also, if you're going to buy locally, ask those questions of the producers. When these guys came out last year to do a presentation at Click, we reached out to Farmers Cow to say, hey, we have folks coming from Vermont. Why don't you come and tell us what great practices you have on your dairy farm that's locally? And I could not get anybody to respond.
No, that's a factory farm.
Yeah,
it's not a local small farmer.
Right, but so my point is,
yeah,
we can do
local
that.
isn't everything.
Local,
we can do that.
Do that
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah,
You can
right.
figure it out. Our co-op does that for us, for many of us, but you can go beyond that if you want to, and ask those questions yourself if you want to. I'm not saying anything bad about them. I'm just saying it was interesting that there was no response, but yeah, that was my point.
I just want to note that the time is it's 8:05, and I don't want to cut off the discussion for those that can stay, but for those who are ready to go, you should just leave the meeting when you are ready and not feel obliged.
Thank
to
you.
continue. But if you have
Thank
questions
you.
still to ask, please ask them. As long as
Yeah,
Thank
we're
you for,
I'm
thank
happy
you for
to.
the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm happy to stick around and answer some questions. Before folks log off, I just will say one last plug is that in a couple of weeks on May Day, May 1st, International Workers' Day, Migrant Justice is calling for a day of action around the Northeast. And we anticipate in about 30 Hannaford stores around the region, customers will be holding actions at those stores to talk with managers and put widespread pressure on the company to join Milk with Dignity. So I know there's no Hannaford in your area, but about an hour away in Uxbridge, Mass is your closest Hannaford. And we're quite certain that an action will be organized there, and we would love to see some folks from your neck of the woods make it there in support. So I'll be following up perhaps with you, Headley, once there's some more information to share that out about the May Day Hannaford Day of Action.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you.
Awesome.
Well, I had one question, which was, have you done the calculation on how much more will I pay for a pint of Ben & Jerry's ice cream because of their participation in Milk with Dignity?
Yeah, none. They haven't raised prices in response to their joining of the Milk with Dignity program, and it does have a cost for them, and they've but it's a cost that they're able to absorb quite comfortably, and there are some particular reasons to Ben & Jerry's, right? It's a premium product. It's a billion-dollar company. They're part of a multi-billion-dollar company in Unilever. But even exempting those factors, and this is the thing about corporate supply chains, is that the labor costs for the suppliers at the bottom of the supply chain become a very small part of the overall product. And so you can make really drastic changes and significantly invest in farm worker wages, labor, and housing conditions. And you're really only touching a percentage of the underlying costs of that product. So we couldn't guarantee that if Hannaford joins the program, the cost of a gallon of milk wouldn't go up a couple cents. We don't know. And that would be up to them how they want to incorporate or pass on those costs. But it's not significant. It wouldn't be something that a consumer would feel in any sort of severe way.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
I want to just remind people that the change of the next class again.
Yeah, so the next class in this series is it's switched to the beginning of May. It's May the 4th, where we'll be talking about the environment. Not a month, not 4 weeks from now, but rather 5 weeks from now.
May 4th,
May 4th,
not 24th.
not 24th. It's
May-
just 1 week later.
May 4th, not May 27th.
Not April 27th. It was scheduled originally as April the 27th.
April
It's now May
27th.
4th.
Yeah, not April 27th. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I envisage a bus trip on May Day up to Uxbridge. I think we could have a good time. Thank you, Will, for coming and sharing the stories of Vermont farm workers. It's something that we all need to know about, and we appreciate you coming to tell us and you doing the work with Migrant Justice. It's great.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. I appreciate the invitation.
And,
Thank you.
And class participants will get an email from Chelsea asking for evaluative comments. It's helpful. Connecticut Humanities paid the cost of putting this series on, and so we need to show them that you love it.
Very
Awesome.
informative. Very
Yeah,
interesting.
Great.
Thanks, y'all. Have a
Okay.
good evening.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Thanks, Headley.
Thank you all. Good night, everybody.
Good night, Headley. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee.
Thanks again, Headley. You did a great job.
Your notes were great.
Oh, good.
It's a fascinating world.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's wild.
Good. Okay.
All right. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.